Chapter 5: A Technique of Self-Analysis. Seated comfortably in your chair or squatting tailor fashion on a rug, breathing quietly and evenly, close your eyes and let your thoughts run over the question of what you really are. You are about to begin your great adventure of self-inquiry. One key to success in your practice is to think very slowly. The wheel of mind is to be slowed down, and consequently it will be unable to rush around from one thing to another, as it did formerly. Think slowly. Next, formulate your words mentally with great care and precision. Choose and select each word accurately. Doing this will clarify your thought, for you cannot find a clear and definite phrase to fit it until you have done so. First, watch your own intellect in its working. Note how thoughts follow one another in endless sequence. Then try to realize that there is someone who thinks. Now ask, who is this thinker? Who is this I that sleeps and wakes up, that thinks and feels, that works and speaks? What is it in us that we call the I? Those who believe that matter is the only thing existing will tell you that it is the body, and that this sense of I am arises within the brain at birth and disappears at the death or disintegration of the body. Now, in order to understand the real nature of this mysterious I, and to find out its true relation to the functions of the body and brain, we must make a penetrating analysis of personality, the apparent self. This kind of self-knowledge does not mean merely sifting and cataloguing one's virtues, vices, and qualities. It really means searching into one's essential spirit. To evoke the real man within you is to evoke your spiritual intelligence. When you can understand what lies behind the eyes which look at you every morning from the mirror, you will understand the mystery of life itself. If you will but steadfastly regard the mystery that is in you, the divine mystery in man, it will eventually yield and display its secret. When a man begins to ask himself what he is, he has taken the first step upon a path which will end only when he has found an answer. For there is a permanent revelation in his heart, but he heeds it not. When a man begins to face his submental mind and tries to strip the veil which covers it, persistent effort will provide its own reward. The world is in a continual condition of flux, and man himself seems to be a mass of changing emotions and thoughts. But if he will take the trouble to make a deep analysis of himself, and to ponder that there is a part of himself which receives the flow of impressions from the external world, and which receives the feelings and thoughts that arise therefrom. This deeper part is the true being of man, the unseen witness, the silent spectator, the overself. There is one thing which no man ever doubts. There is one thing to which every man always clings throughout the varied vicissitudes of life, and that is his own self-existence. He never stops for a moment to ask, "Do I exist?" He accepts it unfailingly. I exist. That consciousness is real. Throughout life, that remains ever. Of this we can be completely certain, but of its limitation to the fleshy frame we cannot be so certain. Let us, therefore, concentrate entirely upon this certainty, the reality of self-existence. Let us endeavor to locate it by confining our attention solely to the notion of self. This, therefore, forms a good starting point for our inquiry, since it is of such universal acceptance. The body changes. It gets feeble or strong. It remains sound or is injured. The mind changes. Its outlook alters with time. Its ideas, are ever in flux, but the I consciousness persists from cradle to grave unchanged. I am happy today. I am miserable tomorrow. These moods are but accidents or incidents in the continuity of the I. Moods of the mind and heart change and pass, but through them all the ego can name itself as which remains unchanging amid the changing, spectator of the passing show of this world. We are aware of all these things through the I, the self. Without it, all would be total blankness. The sense of I am cannot pass away. Therefore, to know oneself is to find that point of consciousness from which observation of these changing moods may take place. It is a sad indication of how man has lost his centrality, his spiritual center of gravity, that this point is usually wholly unnoticed. The I becomes the hapless victim of many different desires and contrary thoughts until its spiritual integrity is restored. A man commonly thinks that he knows what he means by his self. He may be in doubt about other things, but here he seems to be at home. He fancies that with the self he at once comprehends both that it is and what it is. And of course, the fact that one's own existence in some sense is quite beyond doubt. But as to the sense in which this existence is so certain, there is the case is far otherwise. Wrote F. H. Bradley, one of England's thinkers and philosophers. An analysis of the constitution of man is thus the first step. We begin by descending ourselves into ourselves, for at our roots dwells the divine. Whence comes the consciousness of I? It persists underneath all the changing moods of mind. It endures beyond every flux of feeling. It survives accident and conquers time. Does it arise out of our bodies? No, that cannot be, for abnormal psychology and spiritualism conspire together to tell us that it is apart from the flesh. The experiments of men like Sir Oliver Lodge and Sir William Crookes and Professor William McDougall and many other competent investigators into physical research cannot be laughed away. We must look into them and abide by the logical conclusion, however startling this be, or else surrender our search for truth. We dare not omit any data that puts a fresh face on our theories. Whoever will look into the available records, and they are more plentiful than would appear, can discover a sufficient number of cases to verify the truth of this assertion. The connection between mind and body is so intimate that popular thought, whether learned or not, has readily accepted the assumption that the brain is mind and body is self. Yet it is only an assumption. It is possible that, if self-consciousness can exist separately, popular thought is mistaken and the appearance is deceptive. This last thought we must consider, and consider without any bias either for or against the body. A savage, low in the scale of evolution, has no other thought of I than the body and its desires. But a man more evolved, mentally developed, begins to refer to his body as mine, because he has begun to feel that the intellect is no less a part of I, and no less important a part than the body. Certain psychologists and philosophers have persistently followed up the inquiry. Is it possible for a human being to divorce his mind from his physical brain? Such an inquiry obviously presupposes the likelihood that the brain is not necessarily the creator of thoughts, although superficially so. It might be the medium for their expression. Nevertheless, our thinking is married to the brain, which anatomists handle. But just as human marriages sometimes end in divorce, so is it possible for thought and flesh to end in temporary divorce also. Such a result has been brought about on set purpose by means of hypnotism in the West and means of yoga in the East. And in the researches of abnormal psychology and even spiritualism, there are evidences enough that the mind can have an existence of its own apart from the flesh. It would be as sensible for me to attribute the power of thought to this body of mine as it would be to attribute it to the ink of this pen. The body is inspired by one who acts no less than these written words are inspired by one who thinks. Yet people who are professedly intelligent, who would think twice and thrice before they would venture to attribute the qualities of mental creation and logical sense to ink, will not hesitate to bestow these qualities upon the body, which, being matter, is simply ink in another form. The fact is that few people ever stop to consider this question of selfhood, and hence few people ever arrive at the knowledge of its secret. We cannot be body alone because, when a man's body is completely stricken with paralysis, even his sight, touch, hearing, taste, and smell destroyed, he yet remains undiminished as a self-conscious being. Strike off both his hands, both his legs, take his eyes and parts of other organs, still he does not feel less than himself, still the sense of I is as strong as ever. Why should it not be possible that the fleshy body is only a mass of matter which I move, I exercise, and I use, thus indicating that there is someone who moves it, exercises it, and uses it? As your mind plays around the word self, accept for consideration a strange idea. Your first response to this thought may be an attempt to shake off as being too fantastic. But in the sequence, you will be compelled to consider it seriously if you wish to get at its truth. Here is the idea. If the body is the real self, then sleep could never supervene, nor death arrive. If the body is the real self, the awareness of one's existence would persist throughout every hour of the 24. Self is at the center of consciousness, and when sleep arrives, the self has withdrawn from the body, thus blanking out awareness of the latter as one blanks out a scene when the camera lens is covered. This unconsciousness of the body during a sleep is an indication that the self is merely a visitant in the house of flesh. To say that dreams we are retaining this awareness of self whilst asleep is no refutal of this statement. Dream is the bridge between the waking state and the deep sleep state of complete unconsciousness. It represents the threshold which must be crossed if one would penetrate into deep sleep. This last stage is that which one must next consider in order to arrive at a clearer notion of the self. In the dreamless deep sleep state, I become absolutely unconscious of the body, yet somehow I still exist. What is that I doing then, and where is it? When I fall into a dreamless sleep, I forget the world entirely. Even the keenest agony of my body is not strong enough to keep me permanently awake. Even the thought I is forgotten. But self-existence, though temporarily blotted out, still persists in fact, for I awake later and remember my identity. The American Dr. Kreil has produced some cases illustrating this principle, drawn from the abnormal conditions produced by the war. In one case, he tells how an abandoned church was used as a temporary receiving station for soldiers suffering from terrible wounds. The doctor stole into the church at the dead of night and found it perfectly silent. The men had had no sleep for 5 days, and such was their extreme fatigue that not even their ghastly mutilations could keep them awake, and so all of them slept on peacefully unaware of their bodies. The incident, if it means anything at all, means that there is no self-consciousness in the body itself, that the mental sense of selfhood can withdraw from the body. A hint that we cannot be body alone is thus found in the deep dreamless sleep state, when mind is plunged into unconsciousness. When the brain has stopped thinking and created universe disappears from our view, and the actions of the physical body and sense organs are apparently at a standstill. Yet we emerge with the I notion again, despite the seeming near death of the body. Footnote. In the East, there have been occasional authenticated cases of fakirs and yogis who have hibernated like a frog for several days or weeks, with all the vital organs in a state of suspended animation. Yet they have emerged from this death-like trances with a continuing sense of personality. In my previous book, A Search in Secret India, I have described a case which I personally observed, where a yoga brought his heart to a complete cessation of function and even stopped all breathing at will. End footnote. If self-consciousness in the body is due to the fact that self is but a visitant to it, then the disappearance of conscious being when we enter deep sleep is quite explicable. The sense of selfhood has withdrawn, we know not where, and left behind an insentient material form. You have now been inquiring how to think of I. You have been cutting a psychological cross-section through your own personality in the endeavor to reveal its true working. You have inquired whether the I is the body, and you could not definitely find it there. All that you could say with certainty is that it is being used by the self, that the self inheres in it alone, you cannot trace with equal certainty. The sense of being yourself has remained. What is this sense? Can you grasp it? No, you are forced to penetrate deeper than the body and to explore the subtle realms of thoughts and feelings in your quest for the self. Thus, using the scalpel of keen thought, prying into your inner self, you may arrive at the tentative position that the body is only part of yourself and the real essential source of the ego notion has so far not been traced out. I have given the student only a rough outline of the kind of meditation he is to practice, and not every step of the long trail which he will need to follow upon the consideration of self, and it will be for him to develop these suggestive thoughts into more detail in his own way. It may take him a few meditations to reach the point where he can accept these conclusions as probably correct, or it may take him a few months of practice. But until he can do so, he cannot pass on to the second stage of this method. If his mind wanders away, if something arises to distract or disturb him, he should return undisheartened to his practice. The driving determination of the illumined will to bore its way through the solid mountain of thoughts and tendencies which have erected around ourselves in the past will one day receive a fit reward. When it emerges on the other side, it becomes aware of that peace which passeth intellectual understanding. Attention must be brought back again and again to this central theme. Interest must be captured and held upon it. He must press on with his inner inquiry, moving from thought to thought in linked sequence. Concentration is simply the power of controlling attention and of directing it towards one object. The light of the mind is vague and diffused in the average man. What we have to do is to concentrate it until it becomes a powerful searchlight. Then, upon whatever object we throw this powerful beam, we shall be able to see it clearly and to acquire full knowledge about it. And this object may be merely material or may be an abstract idea. This is concentration. To take up one idea and to have neither time nor thought for anything else. A piece of tissue paper might lie on the ground for all time, but nothing exciting may happen to it. Get a burning glass and concentrate the sun's rays on one spot of that paper and something will soon happen. You may have discovered too that the mind is like a restless monkey, but chain it to the post of a single object, tether it to the stake of one line of thought. Then only will the monkey recognize you as its master. It will be more ready to obey your orders. Fix your mind firmly upon the subject of these reflections. Brace it up to the necessary effort of will and concentration, and do not let disheartenment at apparent failure, or slow progress deter you from continuing with the exercise. Thoughts of a totally irrelevant nature are sure to drift into your head in the middle of your practice. Memories of recent events will form themselves before your mind's eye. Pictures connected with personal associations are likely to intrude. Desires, worries, work, and what not will enter uninvited and try to hold the field of attention. But as soon as you become aware of that intrusion is out of place, dismiss it and begin at the point where you left off. It is frequently at early stages of meditation that are the hardest, for then the mind is bombarded by discarded memories, drifting thoughts, and emotional disturbances to an extent which surprises those who have never attempted the practice. The persistent and subconscious pull of the external world becomes apparent when we endeavor thus to recollect ourselves in meditation. We do not turn inwards by inclination. We cling to matter and tie ourselves up with the senses as naturally as a fish prefers the water. Though man is one with the higher power, which may be called God, the fact remains that he has lost the consciousness of this unity, and unless he makes the effort, as in regular meditations, frequent self-observation, or in true prayer, to detach himself increasingly from his external existence, it is unlikely that he will ever recover his divine consciousness. It is one of the hardest tasks we can undertake, this voluntary attempt to concentrate upon an abstract subject for 15 to 30 minutes at a time, and to make man, so constantly extroverted, into a temporary introvert. But it is one of the most valuable. It will enable him to gaze upon the ethereal heights of pure thought. Such intellectual discipline may appear an intolerable labor to those who try it, but the reward is even better than the price we pay for it. The average person is a puppet of environment and outside influences. He is governed by inherited tendencies and suggestions from other minds. To be able to control one's thoughts in the rush and stress of modern life is a valuable accomplishment, and this practice will bring that control. We must dig with the drill of mind beneath the attraction of the physical world and try to find the eternal reality which it hides. Then the secret of life, which has baffled the brilliant intellects of illustrious men, will be discovered and become our joyful possession. The second stage of your inquiry into the true nature of self should be devoted to subjecting your emotional nature to critical analysis. You have tentatively repudiated the physical body as being the sum total of your I consciousness, and so you now turn to the next principal part of yourself. Are you desire, doubt, hate, anger, like and dislike, passion, lust, hope, fear, or any of the other feelings which sway a man in changing sequence from time to time? The argument which applies to the sleeping body applies equally to the sleeping emotions. When the latter are utterly quiescent and dead in dreamless sleep, the I notion still re-emerges upon waking after the apparent death of the emotions. And when, in the waking state, we sometimes experience moments of complete emotionlessness, the sense of personal being nevertheless remains. To transfer the early argument, if self-consciousness in the desires and emotions is due to the fact that self is but a visitant to them, then the disappearance of conscious being when we enter sound sleep is explicable. The sense of selfhood has withdrawn, we know not where, and left behind a collection of feelings which are born out of attractions and repulsions of the sleeping body's sense organs, or else out of the intellect. This would also explain why the sense of selfhood remains unaffected by change of experience. Feelings, desires, and passions carry us hither and thither, but the self continuously exists, and it is perfectly possible for a man to retire from all experience of the outer world, and therefore from all the emotions which such experiences bring with it, as in the conscious trance of the medieval Christian mystic or modern Indian yogi, and yet retain a clear notion of selfhood. If self can divorce itself from emotion in this way and still continue its existence, then self and emotion are two different things, and we cannot consider desires, fears, hates, sympathies, or antipathies, and other emotional states as our real being. Then again, the fact that feelings change so largely, that you might like a person one week and dislike him the next, that the feelings of 10 years ago may no longer represent you as you are today, indicates that they are transient and their essential nature, whereas the sense of I has remained unchanged through all those years. Thus you arrive at the tentative position that neither emotion nor the body is your true self. When this point of view commends itself to you, the third stage may be entered. By this time you will have deepened your power of concentration. You will have begun, during periods of practice, to remove your normal outward consciousness from sight, hearing, and feeling into your interior, and to firmly concentrate your thoughts within yourself at such times. The third stage is devoted to a consideration of the question, am I the thinking intellect? Now, the intellect usually received its knowledge through the five senses, or from memory of such sense-channeled knowledge. The truth we expect to find within the domes of the average man's skull is therefore based on external experience. I put forward what might seem to be an astounding proposition. Assuming that the intellect is not dependent on the flesh for its sole existence, I suggest that it is composed of nothing more than the endless sequence of thoughts, the endless series of ideas, concepts, and memories which normally make up the waking day, and that therefore there is no true selfhood even in the intellect. If all this aggregate of thoughts could be eliminated, then we should find that there is no such thing as a separate reasoning intellectual faculty. The intellect is but a name we give to a series of individual ideas. This final proposition is more difficult to substantiate, for it is rather a question to be decided by personal experience. For I do not hesitate to say that if the intellect is but the continuous train of thoughts which pass and repass in procession through the brain, then, under certain conditions, man may cease to think and yet remain clearly conscious of himself. This has occurred several times, and the history of mysticism, both Oriental and European, attests the fact. Every argument which has applied to the denial of emotion as the true self can now be applied to the denial of intellect. Think, and you will realize that it must be so. Intellect is that which thinks within ourselves. It is not ourself, and this is indicated by the fact that during thinking we feel vaguely that something in us is quietly watching these thoughts. The fact that some insane people lose their intellect and that it is sometimes read to them is another indication that it is a property which can be taken away or restored to a possessor. This was the celebrated attitude of Descartes. He maintained that the mere act of thinking involved the existence of a thinker, of the one who carries on this reflective activity. J'ai pensé, donc je suis. I think, therefore I am, was his famous philosophical proposition. It was a tremendous claim and found its powerful opponents, and its logical result was that Descartes was compelled to infer that this thinker, this I, was intrinsically immaterial and therefore interdependent enough to have its own existence apart from the fleshy body, with which it is nevertheless so intimately bonded. Thus, though Descartes never brought his account of the self to the farther which I propose doing, he made a good point beginning. Further, the moods of thought are in a constant process of change. You may believe in one opinion today and hold the contrary on the morrow. How can you seize on any set of thoughts and say, this represents myself, when next year it may misrepresent you? Yet the sense of being yourself, of I, has remained, whereas your outlook might greatly change. Again, when you have been quietly contemplating some matter, you feel that something in you is watching your thoughts. something which accepts some of them and rejects others. Who is it that thinks? The very fact that you pick and choose among these thoughts indicates that there is a separate unit which uses the brain's mechanism. That something in you. Is it the self? Hitherto, you have been so absorbed and so occupied with your egoistic thoughts, your personal feelings, and physical activities that you have not tried to pin consciousness down to this inner something. You have not tried to detach yourself from thought, feeling, or action for even a moment. Therefore, you have never been able to study the nature of whatever it is that lives within the house of flesh. If we could track down, as we can by this practice, this something in us, we would find it to be our true self. It is always there, but the press of our thoughts and the continual attention given to external objects through the senses cries down its gentle presence. Thinking is a power which may bind us or set us free. The average man unconsciously uses it for the former purpose. The practitioner of this way of self-inquiry consciously uses it to gain freedom. The unstopping wheels of our brain whirl endlessly on its revolutions of petty and important thoughts. And whether they deal with merely trivial matters or with noble and high subjects, it does not seem that we can stop their movement. Perhaps the intellect is only a machine for thinking, rendering its accounts to logic in a purely mechanical manner. Thoughts surge up ceaselessly and disturb the primal repose of mind. So long continued has this process become in the history of man that we have come to regard it as our normal state. To draw the mind back into a calm rest, much more so to be without thoughts, we regard as an abnormal condition. We have taken a tradition for a truth, and it would be well to inquire how far these values of ours are justified. Thus far, we have discovered that the limits hitherto set by ourselves on the notion of self are fictitious, that thoughts, which in their totality constitute the intellect, need not be the psychic barrier which hems us in. By this introspective analysis, we have subjected our own being to critical examination, and taken in turn each principal part of it, endeavoring to discover whether it is the essential self we are seeking, the foundation of the notion I. We have penetrated our inner being, and thus learnt that the outer world, which is revealed to us by our senses, need not be the only condition of our conscious existence. One result of this meditation is that it will eventually enable you to watch how the intellectual, emotional, and bodily machine works in reference to yourself, to get you outside your personal self. There is no danger of becoming ultra-introspective through this exercise, because it renders you more impersonal instead of emphasizing the personality. It draws you away from purely personal moods into utterly impersonal ones. But we have yet to track down the soul. Now, I do not care over much for that word soul, since it carries different meanings to different people. It has served a high use with some lofty spirits of our race, but it has also been tortured into submission by narrow, deluded minds and narrow, deluding religionists. I would fain leave it out of my lines if I could, but I cannot. It comes bearing the grey burden of troublesome theologies, with which a rationalist such as I am would prefer to have nothing to do. But the word self covers all that I mean with a completeness and adequacy that the feebler word does not. The early Hindus understood this so well that their word for self is exactly similar to their word for soul. Self is a collection of personal experiences. It includes all physical, mental, and emotional experiences which string themselves like pearls upon this thread of I. Yet it merges itself with the vast impersonal and divine being which constitutes the true limitless glory of man. One encounters the profoundest difficulties in attempting to make these subtle matters perfectly comprehensible to the ordinary intelligence without indulging in abstruse and abstract metaphysics. But I have made the effort because I know that whoever will patiently ponder over these thoughts in the right prejudiceless spirit will eventually be rewarded by a faint inner recognition of their truth, and by a faint intuitive understanding of their insignificance. It will then be for him to follow up this clue by means of the threefold practice outlined in this book.